Our modern fetish is universal suffrage. That is a pretty striking statement from Emma Goldman, isn't it? It perfectly sets the stage for an era where these big surface-level political victories often masked much deeper, entirely unresolved tensions. We're diving into a period in history where the political establishment truly believed they had finally quieted the voices of dissent, only to find themselves entirely caught off guard.
Welcome to our explanator of Chapter 19, titled Surprises. Today, we're unpacking exactly how the establishment's supreme confidence in their own control was completely shattered by a massive wave of unexpected uprisings.
If you're familiar with Howard Zinn's seminal book, A People's History of the United States, you know he deliberately frames history from the bottom up. We're not looking at things through the eyes of presidents or industrial titans here. We are focusing on everyday people. The workers, the marginalized, the oppressed. And today, we're zooming in on his analysis of the mid-20th century, a time when these supposedly managed populations decided they were absolutely done being ignored.
We've got a lot of ground to cover today. We'll define what a historical surprise actually is, and then we'll see how it played out with the women's rights movement, the defiant reappearance of Native Americans, and finally, uprisings inside the prison system.
Let's jump right into the first part, the actual concept of a historical surprise. So, what is a surprise in this context? Well, Zinn argues that the establishment is continually shocked when groups they assume are safely contained suddenly launch massive rebellions. It's like putting a lid on a boiling pot and walking away. The people in power rely on this false sense of security. They pass a law, or maybe they use military force, and they just assume, okay, problem solved. But they totally miss the fact that the deep, lived memory of oppression doesn't just magically vanish because of a concession made on paper. And when that frustration finally explodes, it completely blindsides the system.
Which brings us to our first major example, the women's rights movement of the early 20th century.
Think about 1920. The 19th Amendment passes. Women get the right to vote. The establishment expected this to basically appease women entirely. The ultimate victory, right? Yet, in the years that followed, their actual subordinate condition in society hardly shifted at all. Getting the vote was a huge political milestone, for sure, but it didn't dismantle the everyday social hierarchy in the workplace or the family. The actual day-to-day reality of economic independence, that barely changed. In fact, early activists totally saw through this superficial concession. Helen Keller, way back in 1911, before the amendment even passed, asked, "We vote? What does that mean?" It perfectly echoes Emma Goldman's warning about the fetish of the vote. These organizers understood that just dropping a piece of paper in a ballot box every few years wasn't going to erase the deep-seated expectation that women were meant to serve. And the culture really pushed back hard to keep them in that serving role. You literally had advice columns from the era, like those by Dorothy Dix, telling women their absolute highest calling was to be a domestic drudge. The system genuinely thought women were safely contained within their own homes, completely neutralized as a political force. But they were so wrong. It was from within those exact homes that this massive, totally unexpected feminist rebellion eventually burst out, catching the establishment completely off guard.
Now let's shift gears and look at the Native American resistance. If the women's movement was a surprise born from domestic containment, the resurgence of Native Americans was a surprise born from what the government believed was total destruction. For centuries, the accepted narrative was simply that Native Americans were gone from the modern landscape. The establishment viewed the violence spanning from 1492 all the way through the 1890s as the definitive end of the story. But as we know now, by the 1960s and 70s, those expectations were completely shattered. To really understand the establishment's mindset, we have to look at the number 300. That's roughly how many Sioux men, women, and children were killed by U.S. cavalry at Wounded Knee in 1890. Zinn points out that shortly after Sitting Bull was assassinated, hundreds of Sioux sought refuge at Pine Ridge, only to be surrounded by cavalry with Hotchkiss guns. A single rifle goes off, and the soldiers unleash a devastating barrage. The government saw this horrific massacre as the permanent closing of the frontier, the final silencing of Native voices.
Fast forward a few decades, and boom, systemic shock. Native Americans returned as a highly visible, incredibly defiant political force in the 60s and 70s. The government essentially thought they were gone forever as a cohesive group. Yet here they were, organizing powerfully to demand their rights, pushing back against those romanticized myths of Western expansion, and reclaiming their own history. Talk about a profound surprise to a system that had literally written them out of the future.
For our final section, we're looking at the ultimate form of physical control,
the prison system.
We've moved from the home to the frontier and now to the literal cages built by the state. If there was any population the establishment thought they had 100% subdued, it was prisoners. These are individuals put entirely out of sight, heavily guarded behind steel and concrete. But even here, among the most physically controlled group in the country, incredible uprisings occurred. It just proves that the human impulse for autonomy really cannot be suppressed, no matter how thick you build the walls.
And what's really fascinating is how these various movements were sustained. It wasn't just physical resistance, it was highly intellectual. A sudden wave of radical new literature started spreading like wildfire. You had authors like Jonathan Kozol, George Dennison, and Ivan Illich publishing works that aggressively questioned how American institutions condition people. These books basically armed these diverse movements with the critical vocabulary they needed to keep the fight going.
So, facing this overwhelming flood of surprises from women, Native Americans, prisoners, and more, what does the establishment do? Well, they don't just roll over. Zinn notes that never in American history had so many movements for change been concentrated into such a short time. The system was reeling, but the establishment regrouped. With 2 centuries of experience in managing dissent, they adjusted their tactics and immediately went back to work trying to neutralize the unrest and stabilize their pyramid of power.
So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought, based on Zinn's historical cycle. If the system is constantly adapting to suppress dissent, who is going to author the next great surprise? We've seen how groups thought to be completely silenced managed to shock the world. As the tools of power and control continue to evolve today, we really have to ask, who is currently being ignored or underestimated right now? And when will they rise up to deliver the next unexpected chapter? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning what you learn.